Out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean during the year 1944, you had this massive collection of coral formations and skinny bits of land that people called the Marshall Islands, all spread out across water and sky that seemed to go on forever. The Japanese military brass looked at these islands and saw them as their first major barrier, the outer defensive ring where they figured they could finally put the brakes on the American naval machine that kept pushing westward without stopping. The Americans, meanwhile, had different ideas altogether. After what happened at Tarawa, where the price in blood had been almost too much to bear, the Marshalls represented something critical to their strategy. These islands were the gateway that would swing open the path toward the Marianas, and if you could take the Marianas, well then you were looking straight at the Japanese home islands themselves. That reality is what pushed Admiral Chester Nimitz to give his approval for what they were calling Operation Flintlock, and it was about as daring a plan as you could imagine. Instead of wasting time and lives taking every little speck of land one by one, they would leap right over the smaller outer islands and drive straight for the throat, hitting Kwajalein Atoll right in its centre, striking at the absolute core of what the Japanese had built for their defensive network. Now Kwajalein itself was not just some random curved piece of sand sitting inside a lagoon. This place mattered in ways that went far beyond its size. It formed a vital connection in the supply chain that kept Japanese forces fed and armed across the Central Pacific. The harbour there was deep enough for major vessels, and they had constructed an airfield capable of handling bomber aircraft. Japanese troops were dug in on the primary island, and intelligence reports put their numbers in the thousands, backed up by even more thousands of Korean and Okinawan workers who had been forced into labour. Up north on the twin islands of Roy and Namur, you had another 3,000 or so defenders whose job was protecting another airfield and guarding massive stockpiles of ammunition. The Japanese had turned these islands into something resembling a fortress made of concrete and steel. Bunkers reinforced with thick concrete walls dotted the landscape. Naval guns measuring 127mm in caliber sat in hardened positions. Anti-tank weapons firing 75mm shells were positioned to cover the beaches. Heavy machine guns were buried in underground shelters that would be nearly impossible to knock out with anything short of a direct hit. The orders coming down from Japanese high command left no room for interpretation either. Every man was expected to fight until his last bullet was spent, and that meant the coming battle was going to be brutal beyond measure, with no quarter asked and none given. But the enemy these Japanese defenders were preparing to face was not the same force that had stumbled onto the beaches at Tarawa months earlier. That nightmare had taught the Pacific Command harsh lessons, and they had learned them well. The divisions being prepared for this assault had spent months training back in Hawaii, and that training was intense and specific. Marines practiced manoeuvring those amphibious tractors through heavy surf conditions until they could do it in their sleep. They learned how to use plough blades that had been mounted on the LVTS, figuring out the best techniques for clearing obstacles and wire. Most importantly, they drilled again and again on coordinating their movements with the naval gunfire that would be supporting them as they approached the shoreline. For the first time in the Pacific War, some of those LVTS were being armed with 37mm guns, which meant they could provide direct fire support even while they were still in the water. Back on the beaches of Hawaii, engineers had constructed full-scale mock-ups of Japanese bunkers and even replicated the coral reef formations, and the troops practiced assaults on these mock-ups day and night, over and over until every movement became automatic. Medical personnel trained to administer first aid right there on the Amtraks while they were still moving. Offshore, hospital ships painted white sat ready and waiting to receive the wounded the moment they could be evacuated. Every possible measure that anyone could think of was being taken to make absolutely certain that Kwajalein would not turn into another Tarawa, would not become another bloodbath where Marines died in the water before they could even reach the sand. The preparation for this assault included something else that had not been done before, at least not on this scale. The lagoon surrounding Kwajalein needed to be reduced to rubble before the main landings could even be considered, and that is exactly what happened over the course of 5 months. This was not merely a prelude or a softening up. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction designed to shatter Japanese defenses before the assault forces ever set foot on their landing craft. The American command had divided up the responsibilities. The United States Army's 7th Infantry Division would handle the assault on the southern island of Kwajalein proper, while the 4th Marine Division drew the assignment of seizing those twin islands of Roy and Nama up in the northern part of the atoll. Before either of these main assaults could proceed, though, advance units needed to clear pathways into the lagoon itself, and that meant capturing the small islets that ringed the atoll, setting up artillery positions on them, and securing safe corridors through which the main landing forces could pass. When dawn started breaking on the 31st of January in 1944, the clock showing around 3:30 in the morning, with just that faint grey light that comes before the sun actually rises, Marine reconnaissance units suddenly burst onto several tiny islets. They hit Jacob, Ivan, Albert, and Abraham, all of them sitting along the atoll's outer reef, and they transformed those little pieces of land into artillery platforms almost immediately. At the same time this was happening, soldiers from the Army's 7th Division were storming ashore on Carter and Cecil Islands, which sat to the west of Kwajalein itself, effectively sealing off the entrances to the lagoon. Once these positions were firmly in American hands, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the naval guns opened up, and when they did, it sounded like the end of the world. Salvo after salvo came crashing down on the Japanese defensive positions, like enormous hammers made of steel and explosive force. Throughout the entire day of January 31st, and continuing into the morning of February 1st, the skies and waters around Kwajalein shook with violence that defied description. The ships of Task Force 53, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, moved in close, sometimes to within just a few thousand meters of their targets, and they poured direct fire into enemy fortifications with a precision and intensity that nobody had seen before in this war. Up above, wave after wave of B-24 Liberator bombers flying in from bases in the Gilbert Islands dropped their payloads, and those bombs pulverized concrete bunkers and leveled the airfield facilities on Roy and Namur. Ammunition depots and fuel storage areas exploded into massive fireballs that shot hundreds of feet into the air, the blasts tearing apart defensive positions and silencing machine guns and anti-aircraft weapons. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, who commanded the Marine Forces, would later say something that stuck with a lot of people. He admitted that he had never loved the Navy quite so much as he did during those hours, because it was their precise and overwhelming firepower that was doing the hard work of smashing the beach defences before his Marines ever had to face them. Aboard the transport ships where American soldiers waited for their turn to go ashore, men could feel the tremors rippling through the steel hulls with every salvo that the big guns fired. They knew their time was coming soon, but very few of them realized that much of the Japanese resistance they would have faced on those landing beaches had already been annihilated by the bombardment. On the other side of all that destruction, those blinding flashes and endless detonations must have seemed like the apocalypse itself. Up on Roy and Namur, just after 8 o'clock in the morning, Japanese artillery crews were trying desperately to adjust their 127mm guns, trying to get them properly aimed, but all their communication lines back to headquarters had been cut. Many of the bunkers had simply collapsed under the weight of the bombardment, burying soldiers alive inside them. Young Japanese officers were clawing at the rubble with their bare hands, and when they finally broke through, all they found was blood and men drawing their last faint breaths. The defenders who survived that bombardment knew with absolute certainty that they were completely cut off from any help. There would be no air support coming. The Japanese Navy was nowhere to be seen. They had maybe a few days' worth of rations left and ammunition that would not last long once the fighting started. But there was this concept in their military culture called gyokusai, which meant to die like shattered jewels rather than accept the disgrace of living in defeat. And so these men carved farewell messages to their families into the walls of whatever bunkers were still standing, gripped their rifles as tightly as they could, and settled in to wait for the enemy to arrive. Meanwhile, back on those American ships, a lot of the Marines found themselves genuinely stunned by the sheer force of their own naval artillery. Every time those big guns fired a salvo, the whole ship would shake, cups and equipment would rattle across tables, and from the rails men could watch black smoke and debris fountaining up into the sky from the islands they were about to assault. Some of them were whispering to each other, wondering out loud if there could possibly be anyone still alive down there after all that fire and steel. The air around the ships was thick and heavy with this acrid mixture of cordite smoke from the guns, burning oil from the targets, and salt spray from the sea, while the thunder of the bombardment rolled across the water like a storm that would never end. Down in the southern part of the atoll, the United States Army's 7th Infantry Division, operating under the command of General Charles Corlett, had been given the mission of capturing Kwajalein Island itself. The command structure split the assault force into 2 wings for the attack. The 184th Infantry Regiment would advance on the right flank, while the 32nd Regiment moved up the left side. From their newly captured positions on Carter and Cecil Islands, American artillery batteries fired thousands upon thousands of rounds in support of the coming assault, and at the same time, battleships continued to pour shells into the central portion of Kwajalein Island, methodically destroying anything that might still be intact. At 9:30 on the morning of February 1st, when the naval bombardment shifted its aim inland to avoid hitting the assault waves, those amphibious tractors, the LVTS that everyone called Amtraks, began crawling up onto the beaches, packed full of soldiers heading toward landing zones that had been reduced to little more than smoking rubble. They encountered only a handful of Japanese snipers who had somehow survived, because most of the defensive positions had already been crushed flat by the bombardment. Those first steps onto Kwajalein met some scattered rifle fire, but American troops quickly pushed through and across the anti-tank ditch that the Japanese had dug, and then they spread inland like a rising tide that nothing could stop. The M4 Sherman tanks followed close behind the infantry, and whenever they encountered a bunker that was still intact, they would blast it with their 75mm main guns until nothing remained but shattered concrete. By noon on that first day, American forces had pushed all the way to the airfield and planted their flag on what had been one of the most vital Japanese supply hubs in the Central Pacific. The battle for Kwajalein Island continued for another 3.5 days after that, and while the fighting was scattered, whenever it happened, it was fierce and brutal. During the nights, whatever Japanese soldiers had survived the bombardment would launch desperate counterattacks, trying to break through the American lines and create some kind of opening, but these attacks were repelled every single time. During the daylight hours, American forces advanced yard by yard, using flamethrowers that sent streams of burning liquid into bunker openings, grenades that they would cook off before throwing them into firing slits, and white phosphorus rounds that created smoke and fire and terror wherever they landed. The island had this whole maze of underground shelters and connecting tunnels, and that network prolonged the struggle because men could move around beneath the surface and pop up where you did not expect them. Many of the Japanese defenders refused to surrender under any circumstances, and instead they would charge out of their positions with bayonets fixed, throwing themselves at American lines in suicidal rushes that accomplished nothing except adding to the body count. By the time morning came on February 4th, the 184th Regiment had driven the remaining enemy forces into the final corner of the island, where there was nowhere left to retreat, while the 32nd Regiment was busy securing the warehouses and barracks facilities. At 10:30 that morning, the last pockets of Japanese resistance were eliminated, and Kwajalein Island was declared secure. When you looked at the casualty figures, they reflected an overwhelming disparity in the outcome. 177 Americans had been killed, with about 1,000 wounded, compared to nearly 5,000 Japanese troops and Korean laborers who were virtually annihilated, with only a few dozen taken prisoner alive. Military analysts who studied the battle afterward estimated that somewhere between 50 and 75% of the Japanese defenders had been killed during that initial naval and aerial bombardment, before the ground battle had even really begun. That was a testament to how thoroughly the American forces had learned from their experiences at Tarawa, and how effective proper preparation and overwhelming firepower could be. Meanwhile, up in the northern section of the atoll, the 4th Marine Division was dealing with a situation that turned out to be more complicated than what the army faced in the south. The island of Roy, sitting on the western side of the twin formation, was assigned to the 23rd Marines, while Namur, over on the eastern side, which was much more densely covered with palm trees and reinforced bunkers, fell to the 24th Marines. The operational plan called for simultaneous landings on both islands at 10 o'clock on the morning of February 1st, but they ran into problems with logistics. There were not enough amphibious tractors available, particularly the armed LVTAS with their 37mm guns, and only about 20 of those were on hand. So the decision was made to delay the assault by about an hour and a half to give more time for repositioning the available Amtracs. During that waiting period, artillery batteries on the captured islets kept pounding their targets, while carrier-based fighters circled overhead, making absolutely certain that any Japanese response would be pinned down before it could develop into a threat. At 11:33 in the morning, the first Amtracs carrying the 23rd Marines came surging through the waves and onto the beaches of Roy. Rocket-equipped LCMs had blanketed the shoreline just moments before with a massive barrage, while those armed LVTAs fired their guns into the shattered palm groves that lined the beach. As the dust and smoke began to clear, Marines splashed out of their vehicles and onto the sand, immediately having to cross a tank ditch that measured about 3 meters wide and then navigate around bomb craters that had filled up with seawater. Within 20 minutes of hitting the beach, they had reached what their maps designated as Objective 01, which was just a few hundred meters inland. Any defensive positions that remained were being knocked out by Sherman tanks with very precise 75mm shots. Captain Scales, who commanded one of the assault companies, had expected to run into heavy resistance, but instead his men encountered only a few isolated snipers who were firing from positions atop collapsed bunkers. By late afternoon, the cruiser Santa Fe had shelled the defences around what they called the nut circle in the centre of the island, and that allowed the infantry to capture the airfield and the warehouse complexes. During this advance inland, a Marine named Private First Class Richard Anderson did something that nobody who saw it would ever forget. When a Japanese grenade landed among his fellow Marines, he threw himself on top of it, sacrificing his own life to save the men around him, an act of selfless heroism that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. By 6 o'clock that evening, Roy was declared secure, and the 23rd Marines could report mission accomplished. Namur, however, was turning into something completely different, something that resembled a bloody trap more than a battle. As the 24th Marines crossed over that anti-tank trench and pushed forward into the shattered palm forests, they found themselves being drawn into a labyrinth created by debris and fortified bunkers that seemed to be everywhere. Units started losing contact with each other. Japanese fire was coming from every direction imaginable, and it seemed like every single step forward cost blood. A Marine officer named Captain John W. Power led a charge against an enemy position, hurling grenades to silence a machine gun nest, and then he pressed onward to destroy another concrete bunker. While he was shielding his men from enemy fire, he was mortally wounded, and his sacrifice was later recognized with the Medal of Honor. On Namur, every single yard of ground was being purchased at a terrible price in American blood. Combat engineers were setting explosive charges to try to clear obstacles, but the barbed wire and fallen palm trunks kept tripping up the advancing troops. Japanese machine guns that had somehow survived the bombardment were firing through the tree trunks, and those 7.7mm rounds would splinter the wood and then ricochet into Marines who were crawling forward on their bellies. Many men were forced to hug the ground so tightly they could taste the dirt, and they would plant explosives at the entrances to bunkers and then scramble backward as fast as they could while flames roared out of the openings. Sweat and grit were blinding the Marines, forcing them to constantly wipe at their eyes just so they could see what was in front of them. For a lot of these young men, this was their very first experience of real combat, and the terror was overwhelming. They would fire their rifles with their eyes squeezed shut, only daring to open them and look once the immediate gunfire had stopped. On the afternoon of that first day of February, tragedy struck on Namur in a way that nobody had anticipated. An American engineer team was working on demolishing a warehouse structure along what they were calling Nut Lane, and nobody realized that the building concealed Japanese torpedo warheads. When the charges went off, the explosion that resulted was like thunder given physical form. A towering column of fire and smoke shot into the sky, and the shockwave from the blast shook the entire island. Marines were hurled through the air like rag dolls. When the casualty reports came in, they showed 20 men killed outright and more than 100 wounded by that single explosion. For a moment, that seemed to stretch on forever. The entire assault came to a complete halt. Debris was raining down from the sky amid the cries and screams of wounded men. Officers scrambled to regroup their scattered units, evacuate the wounded back to aid stations, and reorganize their forces in the middle of scenes that looked like something from hell itself. During the night that followed, from February 1st into the morning of February 2nd, the surviving Japanese defenders launched infiltration attacks and small banzai charges against the American positions. In the pitch darkness, where you could barely see your hand in front of your face, silhouettes carrying bayonets and swords would suddenly dash forward out of nowhere. The night was torn apart by rifle fire, shouted warnings, and the bright flashes of muzzle blasts. In one particular foxhole, when a grenade rolled in among a group of Marines huddled together, a man named Private Richard Sorensen threw himself onto that grenade, sacrificing his life to save 5 of his brothers, another act of incredible valor that would earn him the Medal of Honor. When dawn finally broke, the enemy launched what turned out to be their largest banzai attack of the entire battle. Screaming at the top of their lungs, wielding blades and bayonets, they charged directly into barbed wire barriers, only to be mowed down by concentrated machine gun fire and artillery strikes. The path they took, which became known as Banzai Trail, was soon littered with bodies, creating a grim testament to the futility of their desperate courage. During those tense nighttime hours, Navy corpsmen were working without rest, binding up wounds while listening to the moans and cries of injured men all around them. Many of the wounded were crying out for the dock, begging for help as shrapnel wounds bled and caused terrible pain. Stretcher teams had to crawl on their bellies under covering fire to reach casualties and pull them back to improvised aid stations that had been set up beneath whatever palm trees were still standing. Young Marines forced themselves to remain absolutely silent when they heard Japanese patrols moving nearby, knowing that a single sound or whisper could draw a grenade right into their foxhole. The air in those aid stations was heavy with the smell of blood mixed with antiseptic, and then sudden tropical rainstorms would come sweeping across the island, plastering clothes to skin and adding to the general exhaustion that everyone was feeling. On February 2nd, the Marine commanders made the decision to order a final pincer assault that would crush the last remaining defenders on Namur once and for all. One prong of the attack advanced from the southwest, while the other pushed in from the southeast. Sherman tanks and half-track vehicles led the way, blasting bunkers apart with their 75mm guns and raking suspected positions with heavy machine gun fire. Combat engineers were clearing mines and cutting through wire obstacles to open up lanes that the infantry could advance through safely. A Marine colonel named Diaz led one of these spearhead attacks, but he was killed by shell fire when they reached the final defensive trench line, and his sacrifice was honoured with the Medal of Honor. By midday, the sound of gunfire was dwindling away to scattered shots here and there, and then it fell silent altogether. The isolated Japanese who remained either died in their shelters or committed suicide rather than surrender. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the American flag was raised over Namur, marking the end of the Marine Corps assault and bringing to a close 36 hours of absolutely relentless combat. Of the more than 3,500 Japanese soldiers and Korean labourers who had been defending Roy and Namur, only about 130 surrendered or were captured alive. All the rest were killed. The Marines had suffered 190 men killed and 537 wounded. As the smoke gradually cleared away and men could finally see what they had been fighting through, the entire Kwajalein atoll was firmly in American hands. The aftermath of the battle presented scenes of charred palm trees, shattered concrete bunkers, and beaches that were littered with wreckage of every description. American engineers wasted no time and immediately began converting Roy and Namur into a forward airbase. Within just a matter of days, B-25 Mitchell bombers and fighter aircraft were flying combat missions from the newly repaired runways, striking targets at Eniwetok and Saipan and cutting supply routes that ran from Truk all the way back to the Japanese home islands. The victory at Kwajalein actually shortened the timetable for the assault on the Marianas by approximately 6 months, and it proved beyond any doubt the effectiveness of what they were calling the island-hopping strategy. It also forced the Japanese military leadership to completely rethink their defensive approach to the war. The old idea that you could stop American forces at the beach with fortifications and coastal guns was now clearly obsolete. No amount of beach fortifications could withstand the kind of naval firepower that the United States Navy could bring to bear. From this point forward in the Pacific War, the Japanese shifted their tactics toward building what they called defense in depth, creating layered defensive positions that extended well inland, tactics that would later be seen at places like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, where the fighting would be even more terrible than what had happened at Kwajalein. On the night of February 4, 1944, as the guns finally fell silent across the atoll, flares were being shot up into the sky above Kwajalein Lagoon, illuminating the scene in an eerie light. Down on the beaches, American soldiers were using whatever hours they could find to bury their dead comrades, digging graves in the sand and conducting brief ceremonies. Others were holding memorial services at sea, and the tolling of bells from the hospital ships blended with the sound of waves lapping against the shore, creating a scene that was both solemn and haunting. The military planners had already set the next objectives for these men. Eniwetok and the Caroline chain were next on the list. But many of the men who had fought at Kwajalein had not yet dried the tears they had shed for lost brothers. The severely wounded were being evacuated back to Pearl Harbor on hospital ships, while everyone else immediately began the work of building new runways, repairing the piers and harbor facilities, and clearing away the ruins. These men knew in their hearts that their youth, their innocence, and in many cases the lives of their friends had been traded for a base that they would only occupy for a few months before the tide of war pushed them westward again toward the next objective. With Roy, Namur, and Kwajalein transformed into functioning forward bases, squadrons of B-25 bombers were soon taking off regularly to strike Eniwetok, Truk, and the Palau Islands. Within a matter of months, hundreds of B-24 liberators were flying missions from these same runways to bomb targets in the Marianas and provide support for the upcoming Saipan campaign. And once the Marianas were captured, the B-29 Superfortress bombers finally had bases within range to strike the Japanese home islands directly, hitting Tokyo, Kobe, and Osaka with devastating raids. Like dominoes falling in sequence, Kwajalein became that vital link which opened up the pathway to Guam, Tinian, and ultimately to the end of the war itself with the dropping of the atomic bombs. Many years later, veterans of the Kwajalein campaign would recall with a mixture of pride and sadness that it had all begun on what they had initially thought was just an insignificant strip of sand in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But behind the victory and the strategic success lay all those people who were left unremembered and unmourned. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died without proper graves, their bodies buried in mass graves or left where they fell. Countless Korean labourers had been forced to fight or perform backbreaking toil under conditions that were brutal beyond description, and they had no say in whether they lived or died on these islands. As American troops went through the process of clearing out bunkers and underground shelters, they found personal diaries filled with expressions of homesickness and apologies written to families far away who would never know exactly how their sons and husbands had died. Some Marines kept small mementos that they found, things like a handkerchief, a fragment of a kimono, or a half-empty packet of cigarettes, small reminders that whatever side these men had fought on, they too were human beings and victims of a war that was beyond their control. Their sacrifice stands as a stark reminder of the terrible cost that war exacts from everyone it touches. The Battle of Kwajalein was much more than just a tactical triumph or another island captured in the Pacific. It served as the successful proving ground for all the painful lessons that had been learned at Tarawa. The coordination between amphibious tractors, tanks, and naval gunfire had now been worked out to the point where it functioned almost seamlessly. Artillery was being placed on small captured islets where it could provide direct fire support to the assault waves. Naval gunfire was being brought in dangerously close to the beaches where the troops were landing, and air power was delivering unbroken bombardment that lasted for days before the ground assault even began. These tactical and operational innovations became the blueprint that would be followed throughout the rest of the Pacific campaign, refined and improved with each subsequent operation. The individual stories of men like Richard Anderson, John Power, Richard Sorensen, and Colonel Diaz became enduring symbols within the Marine Corps and the Army of Sacrifice and Valor under fire, examples held up to inspire future generations of American servicemen. And on that quiet night after the battle ended, as gentle waves continued to lap against the coral shores of Kwajalein, washing away some of the blood that had soaked into the sand, the echo of a vow could still be heard if you listened carefully enough. It was the vow that these men had made to themselves and to each other. They had promised that they would keep moving forward, island by island, mile by mile, no matter what the cost, until this war was finally ended and peace could return to these distant islands that had become soaked in blood. They understood that the road ahead was still long, that there would be more islands to take, more beaches to storm, more bunkers to destroy, and more friends to bury. But they had proven at Kwajalein that it could be done, that with proper preparation, overwhelming firepower, and the courage to push forward despite the terror, these fortress islands could be taken and the road to Japan could be opened. The strategic implications of the Kwajalein victory rippled outward across the entire Pacific theatre of operations. Japanese commanders who had believed their outer defensive perimeter could hold against American advances were forced to completely reconsider their assumptions. The speed with which Kwajalein fell, combined with the relatively low American casualties compared to what had been expected, sent shockwaves through the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. They began pulling back their defensive lines, abandoning some outer islands entirely to concentrate forces on what they considered more critical positions. But this strategy of trading space for time was ultimately doomed because the American industrial machine was producing ships, planes, and weapons at a rate that Japan simply could not match. Every island that fell to American forces became another base from which to project power further westward, and the noose around Japan itself grew tighter with each passing month. For the men who fought at Kwajalein, though, these grand strategic considerations were far removed from their daily reality. They were focused on survival, on doing their jobs, on not letting down the men fighting beside them. They dealt with the fear by focusing on the immediate task at hand, whether that was clearing the next bunker, getting the wounded back to an aid station, or making sure their weapons stayed clean and functional in the sand and salt spray. Many of them wrote letters home during the brief periods between combat, letters that tried to explain what they were experiencing without frightening their families too much. They wrote about the beauty of the tropical sunsets, about the friendships they had formed, about missing home cooking and familiar faces. Most of them did not write about the things that would wake them up in the middle of the night for years afterward, the faces of men who had died beside them, the sounds of the wounded crying out in the darkness, the smell of death that hung over the battlefield. The Korean and Okinawan labourers who had been pressed into service by the Japanese military occupied a particularly tragic position in this whole terrible drama. Most of them had no choice in being there. They had been conscripted, forced from their homes, transported to these remote islands, and put to work building the very fortifications that would become their tombs. When the American bombardment began, they died alongside Japanese soldiers, indistinguishable in death, even though they had never chosen to be part of this war. Some of them had tried to surrender when the American troops came ashore, but in the confusion and chaos of combat, it was often impossible to tell who was trying to surrender and who was preparing to attack. Language barriers made communication nearly impossible. The tragedy of these men, caught between two powers and given no voice in their own fate, adds another layer of sorrow to the already dark story of the Pacific War. The medical personnel who served during the Kwajalein operation faced challenges that tested them in ways that no training could fully prepare them for. Navy corpsmen attached to Marine units and Army medics working with the 7th Division found themselves having to make terrible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. With limited supplies of morphine and plasma, they had to triage casualties under fire, working on wounded men while bullets cracked overhead and shells exploded nearby. Many of these corpsmen and medics were barely out of their teens, young men who had perhaps dreamed of becoming doctors someday, but now found themselves doing emergency surgery with inadequate tools in the middle of a battlefield. They worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, slept for a few hours, and then got up to do it all over again. The hospital ships offshore performed miracles of their own, operating rooms running around the clock as boats brought load after load of wounded men from the beaches. Nurses and surgeons worked in shifts that blurred together, fighting to save lives even as the battle on shore continued to produce more casualties. The transformation of Kwajalein from a Japanese stronghold into an American airbase happened with remarkable speed, testament to the engineering capabilities that the United States brought to the Pacific War. Construction battalions, the famous Seabees, came ashore almost before the shooting had stopped completely. They brought with them heavy equipment, tons of construction materials, and a can-do attitude that turned wrecked airfields into functional runways in a matter of days. While Marines and soldiers were still mopping up the last pockets of resistance on one end of an island, Seabees would already be grading runways and building taxiways on the other end. They worked in heat that sometimes exceeded 100 degrees, dealing with coral dust that got into everything and caused respiratory problems. They filled in bomb craters, cleared away wreckage, built fuel storage facilities, erected maintenance hangars, and constructed living quarters for the air crews who would soon be operating from these bases. The speed and efficiency of this construction effort meant that American air power could be projected forward much faster than the Japanese had thought possible, compressing the timeline for subsequent operations. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate participants. News of the Kwajalein victory reached the American home front at a time when people were hungry for good news from the Pacific. The relatively swift capture of what had been described as a heavily fortified Japanese position helped boost morale and reinforced the sense that the tide of the war was truly turning in America's favor. War bond drives used images from Kwajalein, and recruiting offices saw upticks in enlistment. Of course, the news reports back home did not dwell on the ugly details of combat, the shattered bodies and the psychological trauma. The narrative presented to the public was one of American military prowess and inevitable victory, which, while not untrue, glossed over the human cost that made that victory possible. For the Japanese defenders who survived long enough to be taken prisoner, captivity brought its own form of trauma. Many of them had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death, that they could never return home or face their families again. Some of the prisoners attempted suicide even after being captured, unable to reconcile their survival with the code of honor they had been raised with. American intelligence officers worked with interpreters to question these prisoners, trying to gather information about Japanese defensive tactics, unit strengths, and future plans. Some prisoners cooperated, either out of a pragmatic sense that the war was lost or simply because they were too traumatized to resist. Others remained silent, refusing to speak or providing false information. The psychological complexity of these encounters, where young men from vastly different cultures tried to communicate across a gulf of language, ideology, and recent violence, added yet another dimension to the multifaceted tragedy of the Pacific War. The lessons learned from Kwajalein influenced American planning for every subsequent amphibious operation in the Pacific. Staff officers studied what had worked and what had not, refining their techniques and procedures. The importance of overwhelming preparatory bombardment was reinforced, though later battles would show that even the most intense bombardment could not eliminate determined defenders dug into deep fortifications. The value of specialized equipment like armored LVTS and flamethrower tanks was proven, leading to increased production and distribution of these weapons. The need for better coordination between different service branches, between Navy, Marine Corps, and Army units, became even more apparent, and efforts were made to improve joint planning and communication. Training programs back in the States were modified based on after-action reports from Kwajalein, with more emphasis placed on particular skills that had proven critical during the battle. The environmental destruction caused by the battle left scars on Kwajalein that would last for decades. The palm forests that had covered much of the islands were reduced to shattered stumps and burned trunks. The coral reefs around the atoll were damaged by explosions and by the massive amount of debris that ended up in the water. The lagoon itself became contaminated with fuel oil, explosives residue, and the detritus of war. After the war ended, some efforts were made to clean up the worst of the damage, but the islands would never return to their pre-war condition. The native inhabitants who had lived on these islands before the war, most of whom had been evacuated by the Japanese before the fighting started, would find a drastically changed landscape when they eventually returned. Their traditional way of life, already disrupted by Japanese occupation, would be further transformed by the American presence and the permanent military installations that would remain on some of these islands long after the war ended. The financial cost of the Kwajalein operation, while dwarfed by the overall cost of the Pacific War, was still substantial. The ammunition expended during the pre-landing bombardment alone represented a significant investment. Every shell fired by a battleship, every bomb dropped by a B-24, every gallon of fuel burned by ships and aircraft, all of it added up. The equipment lost or damaged during the operation, from landing craft to tanks to personal weapons, had to be replaced. The cost of medical care for the wounded, both immediate battlefield treatment and long-term rehabilitation for those who would carry their injuries for life, represented another huge expenditure. When you factored in the cost of the naval task force, the transport of troops and supplies across thousands of miles of ocean, and the construction of the new bases after the battle, the total bill for Kwajalein ran into many millions of dollars. But from a strategic perspective, most military analysts would argue that it was money well spent because the capture of Kwajalein opened up possibilities that had not existed before and significantly shortened the overall timeline of the Pacific War. The weather during the Kwajalein operation had been generally favorable, which was something of a blessing given how difficult amphibious operations could become in bad conditions. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly during the day, causing heat casualties among troops who were wearing heavy combat gear and body armor. The nights brought some relief from the heat, but also brought the anxiety of potential enemy infiltration attacks. Brief rain squalls would sweep across the islands without warning, turning the coral dust into slippery mud and making visibility even worse in areas where smoke from fires and explosions already obscured vision. The humidity was oppressive, making it difficult to keep weapons functioning properly and causing uniform fabrics to chafe against salt-crusted skin. Despite these environmental challenges, the overall weather pattern during the operation was cooperative enough that it did not seriously impede operations the way storms had affected some other Pacific campaigns. The role of air power in the Kwajalein operation cannot be overstated. From the preliminary strikes that began months before the actual invasion to the close air support provided during the ground fighting, aircraft from Navy carriers and from land bases in the Gilberts played a crucial role. Fighter aircraft flew combat air patrol missions to prevent any Japanese air attacks from reaching the invasion fleet. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers struck at defensive positions, ammunition dumps, and any targets of opportunity. Reconnaissance aircraft provided intelligence on Japanese dispositions and damage assessment after bombardments. The air crews who flew these missions faced their own dangers, from anti-aircraft fire to mechanical failures to the simple risk of having to ditch in the ocean far from friendly ships. Some aircraft were lost to enemy action, others to accidents or weather. The pilots and aircrew who did not return from their missions were mourned by their squadrons, even as the tempo of operations continued without pause. The intelligence preparation for Kwajalein had been extensive, drawing on everything from submarine reconnaissance to aerial photography to information extracted from prisoners taken at other locations. American intelligence officers had built up a detailed picture of Japanese defences, though as always there were gaps and uncertainties. Some defensive positions were not discovered until troops ran into them during the assault. Some intelligence estimates of enemy troop strength turned out to be inaccurate, though fortunately not in ways that seriously jeopardized the operation. The code-breaking efforts that had given Americans such an advantage in the naval war also provided insights into Japanese planning and intentions regarding the defense of the Marshalls. This intelligence advantage helped American commanders make informed decisions about where and how to strike, though no amount of intelligence could eliminate the fog of war once the shooting started. The diversity of the American forces that fought at Kwajalein reflected the breadth of the United States military effort in World War II. Men came from every state, from big cities and small towns, from farms and factories, from every ethnic background that made up the American melting pot. They spoke with different accents, came from different religious traditions, had grown up in different economic circumstances. But on the beaches of Kwajalein, those differences mattered less than the shared experience of combat and the bonds forged under fire. African American soldiers served in segregated units, facing both the enemy and the racism of their own military system. Japanese American soldiers from Hawaii, fighting to prove their loyalty despite the internment of their West Coast counterparts, served with particular distinction. The American military of World War II was imperfect and carried many of the prejudices of its era, but it was also in the process of slowly beginning to change, and the shared sacrifices of combat contributed to that gradual transformation. As the last shots were fired and Kwajalein fell silent, the men who had survived began the process of trying to make sense of what they had experienced. Some threw themselves into the work of reconstruction, finding solace in the familiar routines of military labour. Others sought out chaplains, trying to reconcile what they had seen and done with their religious faith. Many simply tried not to think about it, pushing the memories down deep and focusing on the present moment. The letters they wrote home during this period, when censors would allow, spoke of relief at having survived, sorrow for those who had not, and a weary determination to see the war through to its end. Few of them had illusions anymore about the glory of war. They had seen too much, lost too many friends, been too close to death themselves. What kept them going was a combination of duty, loyalty to their comrades, and the simple human desire to survive and return home. The Kwajalein operation represented a coming of age for American amphibious warfare doctrine. The hard lessons of Tarawa had been learned and applied. The massive firepower of the US Navy had been effectively coordinated with ground assault forces. Specialized equipment had been developed and deployed. Training had been intensive and realistic. Intelligence preparation had been thorough. Medical support had been planned and positioned. And yet, despite all this preparation and all these advantages, the battle had still cost American lives and inflicted terrible wounds on those who survived. The reality was that there was no way to make amphibious assault against a defended position completely safe. The best that could be done was to minimize the risks through preparation and to accept that even with the best planning, men would die. That grim calculus would continue to govern American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War, as each subsequent island was purchased with American blood, even as the overall trajectory of the war moved inexorably toward eventual Allied victory and Japanese defeat.